Released way back in 2007, Gundam 00 is a series that is still often talked about and is fondly remembered by the many who watched it back then. But what I don't often see discussed is the video games that they got. And I'm not talking about video games where they co-star like Super Robot Wars or SD Gundam. I'm talking dedicated 00 video games. We have, very simply, Gundam 00 for the DS and Gundam 00 Gundam Meisters for the PlayStation 2. Both of which were only released in Japan, but are completely playable by someone with no knowledge of the language. Just keep in mind that PlayStation 2 games are region locked, so you'll need either a Japanese console or other means. So, when it comes to forgotten games, oftentimes they're forgotten for a good reason. But sometimes you've got a real diamond in the rough, like Gundam 00 for the DS. Released in March of 2008, this game came in hot after the first season of Gundam 00, and man was it a blast. It might not seem like a lot today, but for a DS game, these graphics really blew my mind, and it also made me slightly less jealous of PSP owners who got even more graphically impressive Gundam games. And what also really shocked me was that the game had voice acting. Sure, it was limited and did get a bit repetitive, but again, for a DS game, this was really cool. And they were also nicely supplemented by good sound effects and a solid, mostly original soundtrack. And despite being new, I do feel like they fit very well with the original 00 soundtrack. But of course, good graphics and good sound design can only get your game so far, especially on an old handheld. So let's talk gameplay. The meat and potatoes of this game is the mission mode, where you get 50 days to destroy the military power of the three major factions. And rather than simply following the anime, you do this by freely selecting which mission you want to undertake first. But you're not just going to be choosing them haphazardly. Each mission lists whose power you will be lowering and by how much. Generally speaking, the harder the mission, the more their power will go down. Plus, if you select a Gundam Meister that is strong against that faction, you will get an additional modifier. Setsuna is strong against the AEU, Lock-On against the Union, Alleluia against the Human Reform League, and Tieria is moderately strong against all three, which is useful for two main reasons. One, there are missions where you'll be tackling two or all three factions, and two, after a mission, your Gundam isn't repaired. It is instead repaired during missions where you select another Gundam. And then after selecting the Gundam you want to use, you can also select a number of supporters that each have their own unique effect, like more damage against a certain faction, fixing your Gundam, giving your Gundam more thrust, etc. The missions themselves then are nice and short, perfect for a handheld, and do have some variety to them. You have the typical destroy everything missions, but you've also got protect missions and missions where you have to take out certain targets. The works, basically. How well you succeed in lowering the power of every faction then will determine the ending you get. There's 5 bad endings, a neutral ending, and a good ending, which will then also allow you to face the final bosses of the game, the Thrones. On top of that, you can also unlock the Nodley and the extra rollout colors, so there is some extra play value to be had. And now that you've had some time to appreciate the gameplay on screen, you might be surprised by how smooth it is. By today's standards, it isn't anything special, but for the DS, I think that this was definitely one of the more impressive 3D games out there. Combine this with a slightly simplified but not oversimplified control scheme, and you've got a game that doesn't just look good, but actually also plays good. Both melee and range attacks have their own button and can be charged up for a slightly stronger attack, which also has better enemy tracking capabilities, and on the touchscreen, you have a button for a special attack whose charge slowly builds up as you wreck more enemies. Once you hit the button, you simply execute a melee combo, and the special attack will be added on at the end. What's unfortunate then is that there are no other gameplay modes, and with the exception of the 1.5 secret mobile suits, there's no other playable mobile suits to unlock. And talking about things that it lacks, the game only has stuff from slightly over halfway season 1. So don't go expecting things like the Jinxes or even Transam. What it did have was the Gunpla Navi. It's like a small catalog of all of the available Gundam 00 Gunpla and even some action figures that were available at the time, as well as a small tutorial on how to build the Gunpla. It's not a lot, but in 2008, this was kind of a cool, gimmicky thing to go through, at least once. So despite missing some key elements, Gundam 00 was able to offer DS players a really solid package, and it is still fun to play today. It might not be perfect, but if you're a big 00 fan, you should really give it a spin. I still had a blast recording footage for this video. Which is not something I can say for the second game, Gundam 00 Gundam Meisters, which was released shortly after the second season in October of 2008. So to lure in unsuspecting buyers, they put the brand spanking new 00 Gundam on the cover. But don't be fooled, this is the only second season thing in the game. Everything else is season 1 only. And this is far from the only disappointment. Let's start with the most obvious thing, the graphics. Saying that they're bland would be putting it nicely. During the PlayStation 2 era, and well, during the PlayStation 3 era as well, Gundam games were often slammed in reviews for not having the greatest graphics. But this is something else considering the time that this was released in. The PlayStation 3 was already out for 2 years in Japan, and yet I feel that this barely looks better than a PlayStation 2 launch game. The mobile suits are basic, the beam effects extremely underwhelming, and the stages are about as barren as they could get away with. And despite some of them looking like vast open spaces, they're actually claustrophobically small. So have fun bumping into invisible walls. And yet, things get even worse with the gameplay, or rather, the lag thereof. If you've been paying attention to the screen, you might think that I've actually been playing rather well. I took out all of the grunts and even wrecked the bosses. But actually, all that I was doing was pushing forward and spamming the square button. The enemy is as dumb as a brick, you never run out of ammo, and every single attack is tied to that one button. The game will automatically decide whether it's melee or ranged, depending on your distance from the enemy. So you don't even have to worry about that. Just keep slamming that button, like a mobile game. The only option you do have is charging your attack, which, as you can see, isn't necessary in the slightest. The simplified control scheme not only makes this game very boring and extremely repetitive, but it also makes all of the mobile suits feel the same. And when you have a game where the Virtue and the Kyrios feel similar, you know something's wrong. Destroying enemies then fills up the O gauge, which, when fills up, allows you to go into the 00 mode. Which sounds way cooler than it actually is. Arrows appear on the screen, and you hit one of the directions with either the directional arrows or the thumbstick. The further you get, the less arrows appear on screen, and the higher your combo will be when the 00 mode ends. So you go from a budget Dynasty Warriors game to a budget rhythm game. Oh man, I'm having so much fun right now. But wait, it gets worse! The biggest variety in the game are QuickTime events, because of course they also needed to include those. They appear at the end of each 00 mode and during cutscenes, so I'm not surprised that even the game itself began telling me to play something else. Yeah, that does sound like the kind of game Patrick would play. In terms of content then, the game is also about as standard as it gets. You get a story mode, where each of the Gundam Meisters get 10 missions, making for a total of 40. There's a score attack, a time attack, a 2-player mode, in case you want to unfriend some people, and a gallery to gawk at the assets that the game has to offer, like the models of the mobile suits or the soundtrack, which is mostly taken from the series with some original tracks peppered in. So at the very least, the game does sound good. And as tempting as it might be for some people to slog through this game to unlock a playable Tyrann or Flag, I feel you, it's just not worth it. The game was barely worth playing back in the day, and it has aged about as well as a non-GN powered mobile suit in Gundam 00's second season. It is amazing how tedious they managed to make a game about giant mechs fighting. If it wasn't for this review, I would have stopped playing after trying the first level. A few hours later then, I was so violently bored that I could only come to one conclusion. This game is promoting conflict and an armed intervention is required. It's sad to say, but this game was forgotten for a very good reason. And that wraps up this review / retrospective of the 00 games. The PlayStation 2 game might not have been anything special, but I do think it's really sad that the DS game never got expanded upon. Like I said in the beginning, it really is a diamond in the rough. Having a game where you can freely select which mission to tackle in order to destroy the military power of the world just goes so well with a series like 00. If only there was a sequel or an upgraded console port. But alas. As always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time.